Hi everyone. Let's try to learn something from Game 4 of the World Championship. So Carlsen has the white pieces, Nepo is black, and Carlsen opens with E4. So they play a Petrov, also known as the Russian game here. And let's learn a little bit about this opening while we're here. So it's advisable for white to take the pawn as Carlsen does. And now it's well known that black should kick the knight back before recapturing. It's considered a mistake for black to immediately recapture the pawn because the move queen to e2 is strong, and sometimes beginners fall into a trap here. The knight on e4 is under attack, and if you retreat it somewhere, then white has this discovered check and he wins the black queen. Well, black can put up more resistance here. He can try queen to e7, counterattacking white's knight, although it looks like white can simply capture black's knight and protect his own. But black has a trick up his sleeve. He can attack white's knight, which is pinned. He can't move or white loses the queen. Nevertheless, white presses on and plays d4 and protects his knight further. And when black takes it, we see that white emerges a pawn up. However, the engine assesses this position as plus 0.6 on Lichess, so it's not completely lost for black. It's just an inferior position for black. It is playable probably in a blitz game. In fact, I saw in the database a game where the super grandmaster Mamedrov had the black pieces against a 2650 grandmaster, and Mamedrov won this position as black in a blitz game. Okay, and there are actually ways where black can keep the material equality in this line and not lose a pawn, but it requires him to worsen his position as a result. So nobody really wants to play this, even though it's not completely busted. It's not, no win has been proven for white after black makes this mistake and recaptures on e4. Nevertheless, there's really no reason to play such a move. Just kick the knight back first and then take on e4. Now here I'm going to mention three moves. In the game, Carlsen played the main line move, d4. Very sensible, putting a pawn in the center, keeping both diagonals open for the bishops. White just wants to develop quickly, put some pressure on that knight on e4, and castle kingside. Okay, but there are other ways to play here. What I like to do as white is play knight to c3. And play usually goes knight takes knight, the d-pawn recaptures. Capturing away from the center is sometimes a good idea if it opens up lines for your pieces and you want to develop quickly, which is exactly what white wants to do. Bishop e7. And here white can develop his queenside first with bishop e3, followed by queen d2. So white typically wants to castle queenside in this kind of position, and we have this opposite side castling where both players can attack the opponent's king. So it's actually a pretty safe, simple way for white to avoid a lot of the theory of the Petrov and get out of the opening unscathed and then just play chess. Okay, so knight to c3 is recommended. All right, another line that grandmasters sometimes play here, I think it's not a way for white to press for an advantage, but it's a safe, solid way for white to play a slower, more maneuvering game. White can try queen e2, pinning the knight, and what black should do is queen e7 to support it and break that pin. And now d3 kicks the knight back, and we get this position that's perfectly symmetrical, but it is white's move, and white usually plays bishop g5, and white's threatening to take the knight on f6 and shatter the pawn structure on the king side. So because of that, black usually takes the queens off the board and then plays bishop e7 to protect the knight. And again, we have a very symmetrical position, but somehow white has gained an extra tempo beyond the one he gets for moving first. because his piece is out on g5, his bishop is on g5, and it's his turn. So it may be worth trying this opening. You can castle queenside again if you like, and try an opposite side castling position. But even though white is a tempo or two up here, the engine assesses this as perfectly equal. Okay, so it's probably pretty drawish. All right, so back to the game. So after knight takes e4, Magnus plays d4. And for similar reasons, Nepo plays d5. Just staking his claim in the center, supporting the knight, opening the diagonal for the dark squared bishop. And now bishop d3 is the normal mainline move, getting ready to castle kingside and pressuring that e4 knight. Bishop d6, putting the bishop on the most active diagonal, and then both players castle. And now c4 is a possible move here to undermine the support of the knight in the center of the board. And if you play c4, I recommend castling first. If you try playing c4 here, for example, then bishop to b4 is kind of an annoying check to meet. So you get your king castled first, and then you can play c4. And c6 was played to support the pawn on d5. Rook e1, putting more pressure on the knight, threatening to win a pawn by taking on e4. So bishop f5 supports the knight further while developing. And now in a lot of openings where black develops his light squared bishop, he sometimes leaves behind a weakness on b7. That pawn is undefended, and white often goes for this move, queen to b3, in situations like this, pressuring that pawn. Okay, and white is also pressuring the pawn on d5 in this position, but it's really not threatened. For example, Nepo plays queen d7, an excellent move to defend the pawn and to defend the loose bishop on f5, ignoring the threat on d5, because that pawn is actually defended by a very common tactic. If white tries to win a pawn, oops, excuse me, let's go back. If white tries to win this pawn, then black has the standard tactic, bishop takes h2 check, winning the white queen with a discovered attack. So that pawn's safe. So white doesn't try to win that pawn. Instead, he plays knight c3, putting more pressure on the e4 knight. Okay, so here black decides it's time to liquidate his knight. He takes on c3, which causes some exchanges here. The bishops get exchanged. And now Carlsen has a big decision to make in this position, but apparently he made it before the game started because he's still in his prep, and he instantly played b takes c3. So what was his decision? Well, the pawn on b7 is still hanging, so he could have considered taking it and attacking the a8 rook instead of recapturing the knight. But there are at least a couple of good replies here for black. The engine assesses this position as perfectly equal. After the move queen d7, black can offer a queen exchange here, and white should not take the rook. He should take that queen, because in this position his queen is completely trapped. There's no way out of the corner. He has no moves out. Black can play knight a4 followed by knight b6, attacking the queen, and white's going to go down material. So this is a strong advantage for black in this position. But white could have played into this and exchanged queens here, and then took the knight on c3 and played this position instead of what occurred in the game. So it was an option for white, but this position as well as the other one are both pretty drawish, I think. The engine assesses them as completely equal. There's another move after queen takes a7 that the engine suggests in this position, which is knight e4, just saving the knight from being captured and giving up that rook on a8, because if white takes it, again, the queen can retreat to d7 and trap that queen in there. But this time, the position is actually equal. White can play like this if he wants to. And he can try to break his queen out with c takes d5, and then c takes d5, and then rook takes e4, hoping for black to take back here, take the rook, because then the queen gets out. And white's actually winning in this position, being 2 pawns up. But black wouldn't take the rook. What he would do here is play knight c6, attacking the queen with the f8 rook. And the queen has nowhere to go. So white would be forced to exchange the queen for the rook and then retreat his own rook somewhere like e1. And here the engine says this is a perfectly equal position. Now white has 2 rooks and a pawn for the queen, which is a material advantage, and normally that would be winning. Or would be a strong advantage, but black is better developed in this position. His pieces are coordinated well, and white still needs to get his pieces into play, and I think that's why black has enough compensation for the slight material deficit. So there's a lot going on in this position right here. Big decision to make. Do you take on b7 or do you take the knight? And Carlsen decided in his prep to take that knight, and then b6 was played to stop queen takes b7. Okay, pair of pawns was traded, and then white plays queen b5, just improving the queen, keeping the black knight off of these squares here, and then Nepo offers a queen trade. Okay, Carlsen protects the queen, and then Nepo does trade the queens, and Carlsen gets this pawn that's stopping 2 pawns, as we say, and so Nepo doesn't want that situation to last, so he immediately passes up that b5 pawn and plays a5. And if I were playing blitz on instinct, I would just snap off that pawn with en passant, because it's a protected passed pawn. A protected passed pawn can be very powerful in an endgame. But Carlsen just ignores it, and here he's still in his prep, and he played knight to h4 instantly. Okay, he's still in his prep, and what he's trying to do with this knight is reroute it to a better square. He wants to play it to f5, gaining a tempo on the bishop, and then maybe move it to e3 to attack that center pawn. So because of that, Nepo pushes g6, keeping the knight off of f5. And now Carlsen plays a very nice move, the type of move I never think of, g4. So he wants to reroute his knight, and I probably would have just put it back on f3 mindlessly. But g4 is a good move because it opens up a square for the knight. Carlsen would like to reroute the knight to e3 by way of g2, so it can pressure that d5 pawn. And you may wonder, why is he pushing the pawn to g4 rather than g3? Well, Carlsen has a purpose for that. The reason he pushed it to g4 is because black can take this knight and get it over to the f6 square to protect the point on d5 that's soon going to come under attack. But then the pawn on g4 can take another step forward and dislodge that knight. So that's why it's on g4. And Nepo does play knight d7, knight g2, and now rook fc8 attacks the c3 pawn. Now, in a position like this, you don't want to defend your weak points. You don't want to be passive and play a move like bishop d2 here. You want to counterattack. So Carlsen correctly gives up this c3 pawn for one of black's pawns, and he plays bishop to f4, attacking the bishop. And the bishops get traded, and now Carlsen is counterattacking a pawn here on d5. Now this ending is, I think it's completely equal. Engine gives this about plus 0.2 or 0.3, or even 0.1, depending on how long you let it sit and think. So there's nothing much going on here, but it's the type of position where I could still lose with either side. Rook takes c3 was played, knight takes d5, attacking the rook. Rook goes to d3, so attacking the d4 pawn. And again, Carlsen doesn't do something passive like putting a rook on d1 to defend. He gets his rooks active. He plays rook to e7, counterattacks, so the knight has to move, or black has to passively protect it. and the knight goes to f8, and the knight can come back into the game on e6, would be a nice square for it later on. But now Carlsen plays for a draw by repetition at this point. He realizes he has nothing in the position. Neither player does. It's all zeros. He plays knight f6 check, and this king has to go to g7. It can't go to h8 because he doesn't want to lose his f pawn here. But after king to g7, then there's knight to e8 check. And again, the king just has to go back to g8. He doesn't want to lose his f pawn. So Carlsen can repeat at this point. He can play knight f6 check and get a threefold repetition. But he probes a little bit. He tries d5 in the position, pushing his passed pawn. Notice it cannot be taken because we have this check and white picks up the rook. And so what Nepo does is he pushes his passed pawn on the a file to get some counterplay. And then Carlsen checks again. He pushes g5 to protect his knight and leave it there. He's still trying to probe Nepo just a little bit, trying to see if there's anything in the position before he takes his perpetual that he has in hand. And Nepo pushes his pawn again. And now at this stage, Carlsen gives in and takes the draw by repetition here. And the players repeat 3 times, and the game is drawn on move 33. It is actually interesting to notice that right here, Carlsen could have tried one more thing. He could have tried rook to c1. Kind of a strange move to consider. I'm sure he considered it and gave it up as pointless. It doesn't look like it should work because this pawn is going to queen in just 2 more moves. But White's threatening to come to c7, making a battery with his rooks. And then rook takes f7 check, king goes in the corner, and rook takes here, check, and the knight takes 1 rook, but then the other rook takes back on h7 for a mate. So doubling up the rooks on this 7th rank and then taking on f7 can lead to a checkmate. Now, in this position, though, Black has everything under control. He would play a2, going for his counterplay, and now the move rook c, c7 actually loses. Which is probably what you would guess because Black is queening with check here. But then after king g2, notice Black has no safe checks, and he's still under threat of checkmate here by taking on f7. Just to illustrate the checkmate, let me make a non-move. And then we have check, king is forced back here, check, this move is forced, and then mate. So we still have that mate threatened in this position, so Black has to be careful. And it doesn't look like Black can even protect this pawn on f7 with any of his pieces. And like I said, he has no safe checks. But there are several ways for Black to draw here. The simplest is just knight d7. A nice interference move so the rooks are not connected. And then when White takes the knight, now he can slide his rook over to f8 and protect that pawn. And there's nothing White can do, and Black's material advantage would win the game. And then one last thing to say, after rook c1 and a2, White still has a draw in hand without going back. We just saw that rook c, c7 is a loss. Black would win that. But White has a nice little clever draw here with rook takes f7 check. Okay, and one line we'll look at is taking the rook, and then the other rook would come here with a check. Notice Black's king has no moves, so he would be forced to interpose with the knight, and then check, and then king f8 is forced, and now White has a perpetual check with the knight. Nice little knight dance here. That's a well-known tactical idea. If the king goes toward the rook, we come back and check and protect the rook, and we can check endlessly. If the king tries to go to g8, we've got this check. And notice the king can't go to h8 because we'd have a mate. So there's a perpetual here. All right, so 4th game was drawn, and I look forward to the 5th game tomorrow. Thanks for watching the video.